the jazz in me that makes me who I am. It's all part of the plan. It's the jazz in me. It's the jazz in me. A special something else because what I do no one else does. Here's a little story, just a little aside. I think I can.
Good afternoon and welcome to our special event today. We are delighted to host this virtual discussion forum on the topic of leadership
Recording
in the time
in progress.
of the COVID-19 crisis.
Got it.
This event is part
accepted.
of a collaboration between the University of Johannesburg
Why can't I hear
and
the
the O.R.
sound?
Tambo School of Leadership. We'd like to thank the O.R. Tambo School for this strategic partnership, which incorporates the need to co-host joint dialogues to grapple with complex and compelling issues, such as the one we are addressing today. I acknowledge the O.R. Tambo board members, in particular, former President Kgalema Motlanthe, the principal, Dr. David Masondo, as well as members of the steering committee, Lorraine Shlapolosa, Sipokazi Mbolo, and the new COO, Tiani Mushlaba. On the UJ side, I'd like to acknowledge our Vice Chancellor, Professor Chilitsi Marwala, who will officially open this event. I offer special thanks to Bettine Janssen van Vieren for bringing us together as a steering committee, and to Helena Dogo and Berenice Moody for logistics. Our two main panelists, I'm very pleased to announce, are Dr. Phumzile Mlambo Ngcuka and Professor Iron Rensburg. And due to the fact that Dr. Mlambo Ngcuka has to leave for the airport, we're going to invite her to speak first. So I'm going to introduce her briefly now, and following her presentation, I will introduce Prof. Marwala, who will come in to offer us his
I can't hear
official
the sound
welcome.
at all.
We will then follow with Professor Iron Rensburg. So I'd like to very briefly introduce Dr. Phumzile Mlambo Ngcuka. She is the former United Nations Under-Secretary General and Executive Director of the United Nations Women. She was sworn into office on the 19th of August, 2013. And in her time, the United Nations Women was a small agency that grew to raise $40 billion for women and girls of the world. She has brought a wealth of experience and expertise to this position, having devoted her career to issues of human rights, equality, and social and gender justice. We are very pleased to have you with us today, Dr. Phumzile. You may begin. You have approximately 30 minutes to do your presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I promise you I will not use 30 minutes for my presentation. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
We do hear you.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes,
Okay,
you are
thank
audible,
you.
Doc.
Yes,
Thank you.
Doctor. I'm affordable.
Okay, thank you very much. I was saying I promise you I will not use 30 minutes. I will just make some brief remarks. Firstly, thank you to Professor Marawa. Thank you to the audience, and thank you for hosting this important event. We are discussing leadership in a time of crisis, a crisis that is both general and specific. The world and our country is facing these multiple challenges. It is specific because we have different conditions that direct us how we respond to the crisis, but it is also general because it affects the whole world, and therefore everywhere in the world we are dealing with the same crisis. Having just come out of the UN, it is indeed a global crisis that impacts both small and big countries, and the reaction of these countries is also different. The pandemic is also a challenge for the world because of the way resources are accessible to the different countries and the way the countries who control resources manage the resources for themselves. We are in a situation where developing nations have struggled to access vaccination. This may not be because of the leadership of those countries, but more the leadership of the countries who are the ones that are keeping resources more to themselves and not sharing broadly with the rest of the world. There's another issue when it comes to the way we have managed this crisis as leaders of the world. If you think in the case of the US, for instance, there was a time when the country was facing a crisis that did not look like it was ever gonna end. But with a change of administration, change of leadership, in a few months, almost 2/3 of the country has been vaccinated. I guess the lesson we take from that is the importance of having leaders who can keep their eyes on the ball. In a crisis of this nature, where people die in large numbers, it is impossible to take the most intense outlook and make sure that every step that are taken by the country and the leadership are focused on saving lives. But of course, you also have to focus on other aspects that accompany the health of the nation, the economic health of the nation, and the welfare of the rest of the population. A crisis of the nature of the pandemic that we are facing is also not gender neutral. We have seen how in this crisis, women has been disproportionately impacted. The leadership that we need in our countries needs to be aware of that. 2/3 of the jobs, for instance, that have been lost during this pandemic were lost by women. This is because women are dominant in the social sector, in the hospitality and tourism sector. The response to the crisis, therefore, needs to take into account how we, the rest of their lives, staying in a situation of a crisis, even when the crisis is over. We also saw that during this crisis, the violence against women increased significantly because this violence is also a shadow pandemic that gave us an opportunity to react in a particular way so that we also are addressing the long term. A critical move on the part of our leadership would be to take advantage of this situation and address this ever lingering issue, which is obviously unacceptable in our societies. Then there's been the issue of stimulus packages that were voted to the populations of different countries. We noticed that notwithstanding that economically the crisis had a high impact on particular categories of people, the money that was voted did not always go to the people who needed it most. I'm talking about people in the informal sector, people who are in jobs where they have no contract, and people that are in countries where labor law does not cover them. We needed a dedicated way to address this. And in addressing it, to establish ways of dealing with our economies that do not leave us vulnerable in that manner. We should be able to address the people who are constantly being exposed to these risks so that if we have another crisis, we will be in a similar situation. we will not have people that are not covered by the labor laws. We will make sure that those that are in the informal sector have been addressed to create linkages between the informal sector and the formal sector. We also have seen that women and girls and communities in general that are poor lack the ICT skills that puts them in a particular situation when we think about the future of work. An aggressive way of addressing this has also been highlighted as a great need. And as leaders in those countries, it becomes our responsibility to look at how we can make sure that both those who are in schools and those that are out of school are addressed, so that we do not create another generation that will not cope with the future of work as we see it. Let me end by highlighting the issue of climate change, which, just like this pandemic, also requires a leadership that can differentiate the trees from the wood and make sure that you focus on looking at where, separating the trees from the forest and making sure that we are there for focus on the steps that you take. We need to be transitioning to greener economies. We need to make sure that in countries where fossil fuels are dominating, we have a transition plan. Failure to do that would mean a catastrophe that we cannot manage. An able leadership in a time of crisis is able to make these hard decisions and enforce them with everything they have, consulting the people, but at the same time being firm on how these decisions must be needed. Because if we fail to do that, the challenges of the situation in our hands. As I end, I want to go back to the pandemic as we face it now. Yes, it is a health pandemic, but it is also an economic crisis. It is a socio-economic crisis that impacts people across the board, but it is also harsher on those who have less. This is one pandemic that has been most severe on those who have less and those whose needs have been neglected for a long time. In addressing and recovering from this pandemic, it is important that we solve the problems of those who do not have, so that when the next crisis comes, we are not as exposed as we are today, because it is not whether another pandemic will come, it is when and whether we will be ready to deal with it. So we have our hands full of the challenge, and it is clear that we need to stand up and take the situation by our hands. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka. We are very pleased that you've had the time to come and speak to us despite your very busy schedule. So thank you very much. I'd now like to invite Professor Marwala to join us and to officially open the event. And to some extent, our Vice Chancellor needs very little introduction, but just a few comments. Professor Marwala is Vice Chancellor and Principal of the University of Johannesburg. He is an accomplished scholar with multidisciplinary research interests that include the theory and application of artificial intelligence to engineering, as well as computer science, finance, social science, and medicine. He has an extensive track record in human capacity development and has published 23 books on artificial intelligence. Thank you, Prof. Marwala. I think you may begin.
No, thank you very much, Camilla, for that introduction. I hope all of you can actually be able to hear me. I would like to acknowledge Dr. Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka, our former Deputy President of South Africa. I also would like to acknowledge the presence of our former Vice Chancellor and Principal, Professor Aaron Rensbeck. We are always glad to see you back at the University of Johannesburg. I also would like to acknowledge the presence of Professor Ashwin Desai, who is also going to be speaking a little bit later, and all of you who are here today with us. It is indeed my pleasure to welcome you all to this discussion forum on leadership in time of the COVID crisis, organized by the University of Johannesburg in partnership with the O.R. Tambo School of Leadership. The COVID-19 pandemic demonstrably took its toll on the globe and shone a spotlight on leadership. Faced with unforeseeable and extreme circumstances, this proved to be a true test for leadership. The phrase, "business cannot continue as usual," has been bandied about, but it is, in fact, a truism. Faced with the seemingly impossible task of righting the ship against a turbulent and unpredictable backdrop, leaders have had to take extraordinary measures, create Marshall plans, and deploy resources. A trawl through historical events will demonstrate that in great moments of uncertainty, such as the pandemic, the very notion of leadership comes to the fore. We look for guidance from our leaders and are distinctly more critical of their responses. As the pandemic rolled into its second year, it became increasingly apparent that leadership could not be discussed in the abstract or in terms of theoretical frameworks. Rather, leadership as a practice needs to be interrogated, and layers of complexities have to be unpacked. We are certainly ushering in a new epoch of leadership, in part due to the pandemic, but also because of the steep challenges we face, ranging from climate change to social media and the digital divide that deepens our understanding of inequality. The author of Sacred Economics perhaps best summed it up, as he said, and I quote, "The present convergence of crisis in money, energy, education, health, water, soil, climate, politics, the environment, and more, is a birth crisis, expelling us from the old world into a new," close quote. Aptly, we must now ask, how do we begin to create a new cohort of leaders against this backdrop? How do we begin as educators to educate new crop of leaders so that they will be equal to the task in this new normal? The first step, I would argue, is to establish what leadership in the 21st century should look like. There, of course, is no blanket approach, but as we grapple with unprecedented challenges, there are lessons to be learned and wisdom to share. As this period has demonstrated, to be a leader is not simply to take up a title and a position. Often in research on leadership, there's a consensus of what constitutes a good leader, a charismatic leader, and a leader who will make an organization or the world sit up and hold up on the pedestal for us to emulate. We can all agree and acknowledge that Oliver Tambo was a great leader. We can all agree that Umadiba was a great leader. We can all agree that Chris Hani, and to name a few, Steve Biko, were great leaders. Our histories have described these qualities, and there is a general acknowledgement that they had very specific traits that can be analyzed. As we contemplate the moral mess of the world, we need to also begin real conversations about what is poor or bad leadership. The literature is replete on the damage that can be unleashed by unsavory leadership. But I wonder if we need to wait for history to unfold before we recognize and label it as such. As we face an ever-changing context, leadership must speak to it. Will we continue to widen our disparities, or will we find solutions to some of our most deep-seated inequities? Will we continue to let intolerance define our world order, or in the disarray we find ourselves in, we will forge a sense of unity? Those are the things that we have to be thinking about as universities. There are leadership lessons to be learned from the successes and mistakes from the last year. If we are to use the pandemic as a yardstick for leadership strategies going forward, it must remain stuck in our minds what accounted to our successes. Against this backdrop, I was particularly happy that Dr. Mlambo Nguka actually addressed us, and also that my predecessor, Professor Aaron Rensbeck, will also address us. Both of these are formidable leaders and have led decisively amid unprecedented crises. Each time such an event occurs, we need to critically reflect on the experiences, the narratives, and historic moments as experienced by leaders. One of the projects that we are undergoing at the University of Johannesburg is the Africa Biography Project. And the aim of that is to unpack some of the most influential leaders of our times and the times gone by, and understand what they were all about. So for it is the telling of the story that we can derive lessons that will stand us in good stead. Both the panelists have been captains of various ships and they have steered the course for their organizations and people. Their ability to steer through sometimes choppy waters is now acclaimed, but we need to ensure that we understand how their views and perspectives can be applied in our lives. Over the course of this afternoon, they will speak to the crucial topics such as the response of higher education to the pandemic, lessons learned by universities, the role of women leaders in responding to the COVID-19 crisis, rethinking leadership in efforts to rebuild South Africa in the post-COVID era, and digital transformation. I am reminded of the words of the former United States President Harry Truman, who once said, and I quote, "In periods where there is no leadership, society stands still. Progress occurs when courageous, skillful leaders seize the opportunity to change things for the better," close quote. Usually as life unfolds with no certainty of what the future will hold, there are windows of opportunity that must be seized. These are powerful conversations about leadership that must happen, but must take place in all public spaces. The narratives of yesterday can shape how we respond to both the present and the future. Deeply ingrained in these narratives or reflections will be glimmerings of light that can be used to ease us out of darkness. This is precisely why the organization of these events with a strong and strident focus on leadership is required if we are to influence our current generation and make sense and puzzle our way through this very fast changing part of the life of our planet. We listen with intent and trust that each time we are poised at a specific juncture, we can look back and learn from these discussions. I thank you. Ngiyabonga enkosi bayadanki ngiyalibonga.
Thank you very much, Prof. Morwala, for those introductory comments and for the wise words on leadership strategies and lessons learned and things we can take forward in thinking about the critical issues that we need to address on questions of leadership. I'm now going to ask Prof. Iron Rensburg to address us. We're all very happy to see our previous Vice Chancellor join us today. And just a short introduction for Professor Iron Rensburg. He is the interim Ombud of the University of Cape Town, chairperson of the South African National UNESCO Commission, chairperson of the Ministerial Committee on the Review of Higher Education, Science and Technology Landscape, senior advisor to the principal and a visiting professor at King's College London, and non-executive director at the APSA Group, and most recently has served as the administrator of Vaal University of Technology. So Prof. Rensburg, welcome, and I think you can address us now. We will also give you approximately 30 minutes or longer if you wish. Thank you, Prof. Rensburg.
Thank you very much, Camilla. Let me begin by acknowledging our fellow hosts, Professor Marwala and Dr. Masondo. Of course, yourself as well, Camilla, as our program director, and our fellow panelists, Her Excellency Dr. Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka in her absence, also my colleague and friend, Professor Ashwin Desai, colleagues, comrades and friends, ladies and gentlemen. It's always a great and special honor to be with you, and in particular, to have been invited to join you this afternoon in this extremely important reflection. So today we are seeking to assess higher education responses to the COVID-19 pandemic, digital transformation in the higher education sector here in South Africa, and to also assess key lessons learned by universities that will prepare them for a post-COVID era. I almost wanted to say an imagined post-COVID era. This assessment, of course, occurs within a context and of many challenges, from declining internationalism to hard-won but thin-wearing international trade and other global protocols, to growing nationalism and tribalism, all seemingly aimed at making some nations, in the context of contest and conquest, great again. Shall I say ironically great again? And these developments do place universities and academics and their freedoms and autonomies that are at the center of international contest and conquest at considerable risk. In these circumstances, universities can do far better by making self-evident their virtues in terms of their foundational and new emergent values: institutional autonomy, academic freedom, ever transforming, inclusivity, diversity, pluralism, dialoguing, social justice, caring, and empathic. They should also, equally so, make far more self-evident their significant, important, and dynamic roles, responsibilities, and the value of critical discourse and engagement. Universities need to become far more communicative and engaged with their communities, both internal and external, and with their critical questions, ranging from tolerance, sharply varying conflictual and contentious opinions, racism, patriarchy, misogyny, bigotry, xenophobia, Islamophobia, fascist nationalism, tribalism, sectarianism, despotism, authoritarianism, tyranny, belligerence, and grandstanding. Indeed, universities cannot allow themselves to be blocked out of public discourse and should never give in to the forces of retrogression. Instead, always striving to serve the greater good and their higher purposes. In this context, the confluence of COVID-19 and the possibilities embedded within the fourth industrial revolution have opened up the possibilities to catapult universities' responses to these contextual challenges. It is not as if universities were oblivious to the radically different learning, teaching, research, and community service expectations of Generation Alpha, the generation born in the early 2010s in the era of Google and smartphones. Many academics were already exploring blended learning and flipped classrooms. Their innovations were simply not achieving systemic, institutional, and system-wide trending. Indeed, the confluence of COVID-19 and the possibilities of the fourth industrial revolution technologies have now catalyzed new, fresh, and systemic thinking from interdisciplinary to problem-solving and project and theme-based learning to learning that incorporates blended, virtual, and augmented reality to refreshing online learning practices. Consider, for example, the groundbreaking new engineering program offered in London by the Plus Alliance, a consortium of King's College London, the University of New South Wales, and Arizona State University. This program allegedly prohibits lecturing, and students learn through cross-cutting and cross-disciplinary projects. It also plugs into the new generation students' agency. It also does rely on exceptional curriculum and assessment design. In respect of teaching and learning, and here in South Africa, universities have shown varying abilities to respond to the various COVID-19 related lockdowns and the prohibition on traditional teaching and learning methods. Some, such as UJ, had readied themselves at least a decade earlier for blended and possibly online learning. Others, mainly our under-resourced historically Black universities and universities of technology, did not have the immediate capabilities to ramp up online learning as fast. What we've learned from both sets of institutions is the immense innovativeness and resilience of our academics who have responded absolutely magnificently to this call to rapidly shift the offering of their modules and courses to online learning modes. We've also learned of students' innovativeness and resilience, although I still struggle with the idea of effective learning and teaching via a smartphone rather than an e-tablet or a laptop, but that's me. In the immediate future, the promise of virtual and augmented reality in teaching and learning, the so-called metaverse, will be a new reality that will also have to be contended with, as we will have to contend with new assessment methodologies, including online assessment. In this regard, it's quite striking that we were able to move a mountain within a matter of weeks. That is, we were able to move to continuous assessment almost overnight without the blink of an eye. And so we've demonstrated that in an emergency, we do have immense capability across all our universities to respond and to do so exceedingly well. This, of course, also, I should make the footnote, Prof. Marwala and Prof. Naidu, that we also have to acknowledge your leadership as deans, as vice chancellors, alongside our academics. And so the response has indeed been exceedingly well. Now, as we celebrate the successes of our universities, let us also take heed. Our schools and colleges have not done nearly as well. And unless this is remediated urgently, the gains, the valuable gains made in school and college education since the advent of our democracy will be wiped out within the next year or two. Our efforts have also seen us take on the mobile telephone service providers. And while electronic data prices were reset downwards for students and staff, a far more radical intervention may be required, such as universities themselves considering taking on, through a special dispensation from ICASA, the role of the original providers of electronic bandwidth and data. Fool's paradise? Maybe not. Similarly, the availability and pricing of e-tablets and laptops proved a major challenge and will also require far more radical interventions if we were to be able to shift from the massification of higher education, which sees us move to a participation level of 35% by 2030, to the full democratization of university education that sees those numbers rise possibly close to 70% by 2040. It is here where the confluence of the catalytic effect of COVID-19 and the potential of the fourth industrial revolution should be brought together for the benefit of our institutions. So, for example, why does South Africa have to import e-tablets and laptops, and where they are manufactured locally, it is simply an assembly or reassembly plant? Triggered by the, and I guess I should make the note there, that not only has COVID-19 therefore catalyzed us into action, it must also catalyze us thinking right through the value chain of all of these key elements that make possible blended and online learning by way of example. Now, triggered by the devastating health consequences of COVID-19, universities have also excelled in the research and innovation space. These actions have ranged from reverse engineering ventilators to designing and developing non-invasive ventilators, to designing and developing at scale personal protective equipment for health professionals. And here I'm speaking of our South African universities, including universities of technology, as well as historically Black institutions. We've also helped develop vaccines, to initiating vaccine clinical trials, to undertaking public social research to inform public policy, such as done by UJ with the HSRC. South African academics have been at the forefront of this global emergency response enterprise, and we commend them for their extraordinary knowledge, insights, wisdom, and the application of these to their long and enduring academic craft. So then what do we learn from this? We learn that within the complex and contested interstices of our universities, our academics are simply giving life to their respective academic crafts, whether in teaching and learning, research and innovation and scholarship, or in serving the public. Yes, catapulted in some respects by the COVID-19 pandemic and enabled in part by the fourth industrial revolution, but not found wanting, fully appreciative of the import of their academic craft in the evolving and contested human enterprise. We also learn of the import of challenging trade regimes and intellectual property protocols that, such as we have seen in the instance of vaccine nationalism, inhibit and price out of the market the people of the political South. We also learn that as a result of this political activism, full and finished vaccine operations are now in place in parts of the political South, including in 2 sites here in South Africa, Gqeberha and in Cape Town. However, building upon our rich and fine research and clinical trial traditions, we must now take our work upstream in the vaccine value chain so that we can progress towards producing, trialing, and finishing and filling our own vaccines. We also learn of the import and the value of mounting a systemic institutional response to the learning, teaching, research, and public service needs of Generation Alpha, and how this response can enable the democratization of universities and the democratization of digitalization. Now, throughout the course of history, we observe multiple disruptions, such as COVID-19 and the Fourth Industrial Revolution, many of seismic proportions. And as we consider the implications of our current COVID-19 disruption, particularly on the trajectories of our universities, we should consider the results, the prospects, and the lessons learned from history. Consider some of these disruptions over the last 300 to 500 years, in fact, to 1,000 years, beginning at least in this reflection with feudalism and serfdom and its disruption, and of course, land occupation movements associated with it. Consider the disruption associated with slave trade, deeply associated with the Second Industrial Revolution. Consider colonization, deeply associated with the Third Industrial Revolution and the decolonization movements. Consider the Industrial Revolution in its own right, the climate change and the associated energy poverty, food poverty, and land poverty, and the climate change mitigation movements that have been spawned by this very climate change. Consider racism and the rise of Black consciousness and other anti-racism movements. Consider the anti-Muslim Islamophobia and the anti-xenophobia movements in response to these. Consider the rise of parliamentarism, one-partyism and multi-partyism and coalitions. These are all disruptions. Military dictatorships and police states and freedom movements that were spawned. Famine and global movements for food security come to mind. War and peace movements, nuclear and anti-nuclear movements, Bantu education and the 76 uprising here in our own country, apartheid and the global anti-apartheid movement, apartheid racism and dictatorship, and the 1980s grassroots-based ungovernability, people's power and free Mandela movements. Consider the disruption brought about by HIV/AIDS and Ebola, the fear and stigmatization, and the resultant pharmaceutical and non-pharmaceutical responses as incomplete as they are. Consider the excluding cis heterosexual societies and the rise of the LGBTQIA+ movement. Mounting student debt, unsustainably high university fees and fees must fall. Colonial university education and roads must fall. Tribalism, narrow nationalism, narrow Protestantism, I could almost say, parochialism, nihilism, and the rise of wokeism. Consider racism and white privilege on the one hand, and the recent rise of Black Lives Matter. Rape, gender-based violence, and the femicide culture and the rise of the Me Too movement. These are just some examples over the course of the last 1,000 years of significant disruptions of a similar kind to COVID-19 and to the fourth industrial revolutions. And so what have we learned from these disruptions? Let us just note some of these. We observe the disruptions are not limited to national borders. Instead, these are intersecting, multiple, often combined, aligned, and mutually supporting, giving rise to such local, national, and global movements and counter movements to those very progressive movements. We observe both retrogression, on the one hand, which had spawned progressivism. We observe that every step has produced progressively deeper and wider democratization and inclusiveness. On leadership, what then should be top of mind? I believe it should be the ongoing project of nurturing, advocating, and defending 5 freedoms, if you like. Inclusive, diverse, and caring societies at the political level, social and economic justice at the economic level, human dignity and Ubuntu, freedom in pluralistic societies, and equality. So what then are the elements of what I consider to be a radical democracy? Each disruption or contradiction must provide the opportunity for advocating, advancing, and entrenching deeper, wider, and more inclusive societies. Let's apply just this one element by way of example to COVID-19 and its catalytic effect. It has catalyzed opportunity for advocating, advancing, and entrenching deeper, wider, and more inclusive societies. So that even as we face vaccine nationalism, we press open, we push open, we force open the space for nations such as South Africa in the political South to be able to move up the value chain from finish and full to production, to actually consider the possibilities of the production, clinical trialing, and local manufacture of vaccines. In the case of universities and teaching and learning, we suddenly see new opportunities and possibilities for blended and online learning, and the real possibility of moving beyond massification to democratizing universities. And so this work of advancing a radical democracy project is at times painstakingly and frustratingly slow. However, it is a continuing struggle. Each progressive advance alters the terrain of conflict that must be defended in multiple arenas for it to endure. The future is about building upon the foundations laid and pressing on towards the many residual and future challenges. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prof. Rensburg, for that excellent and comprehensive overview. We've had a slight change of program, so I'm going to ask the person who should have come in right at the end, Professor Ashwin Desai, to come in a bit earlier so that he can actually reflect on the presentations that we've had thus far. And after that, I will open up for questions, and then we will take the questions as they come. I'm going to just briefly introduce Professor Desai to you. Professor Ashwin Desai is a professor in the Department of Sociology here at the University of Johannesburg. He is a prolific writer whose work has been published in academic and popular books and journals around the world. And his specific interests are in the sociology of sport, social identity, and social movements. So Professor Desai, are you with us? Would you like to come in and serve your role as discussant? Thank you, Professor Desai.
Thank you so much, Camilla, and greetings to my old Vice Chancellor, Professor Rensburg, and my present Vice Chancellor, Professor Marwala, my friend, Dr. David Masondo. I must admit that I feel somewhat awkward, probably feel like a lipstick woman talking to the Taliban or a queer man talking to the Pope, because really the challenge that has been presented to us is about leadership in the time of COVID. And I must admit that everything in my life that I've tried to lead has ended in stark failure. And so whoever's listening to me today needs to take that into consideration. Most times one is judged in leadership by what you set out to do and the legacy that you leave behind. And Oliver Reginald Tambo set a task of the defeat of apartheid. And he saw that come to pass. And in that process, he had to put up with creating unity between nationalists, communists, between the factions of the Cold War, between taking opportunity when it presented itself. And both our present ex-vice chancellor already have a legacy about leadership that is the University of Johannesburg as a world-class African university. However, I must say that yesterday when I was watching the television, I was watching Boris Johnson talk at Parliament, and I thought, has the world really gone mad? Here was the unreconstructed conservative, the Thatcherite of our times, the neoliberal, and he was talking about increased taxes, more money for the National Health Service. I mean, he was talking like he's a stark raving communist, and the Labour Party in opposition were completely aghast because Boris Johnson had plagiarized all their policies. And so it gives us a sense of what COVID has done, but what COVID affords for those of us who come with the certainties of a couple of years ago, of our macroeconomic policies, of our mega projects, of seeing the world unfold according to particular commandments. Every one of those commandments has been broken. And whether we can have the capacity, whether we can have the inventiveness and imagination to create a new world out of this opportunity is something that I think we need to openly talk about. And those who think they can just plot a straight line out of this are lying. These can only be soothsayers. These can only be fortune tellers, because many of us don't know. And so I want to start with that. But does this mean, as the end of ideology, does this mean that the prism and the usual chestnuts in which we see the world are gone out? Not at all. And I think Prof. Rensburg has indicated that quite decisively in the way he has talked about the COVID and what it has brought to the fore. Many people might say that the world is now divided into those who have the double shot and those who don't have the vaccine. No, what this moment has taught us is that our learning, our teaching about an unequal world, our sense, the great divide between the North and the South, our feeling that imperialism is with us, a sense that when it comes to a life or death situation, the North, in preaching a global world, will put up their barriers once more and preach a narrow racial chauvinism. And so those things are still with us. And we need to take cognizance of that. And we need to think about ourselves in this tiny part of the end of Africa, how we respond to this. So the two things that I just wanted to mention in terms of where we are and the kinds of leaderships that we have to think about. Firstly, I think leadership often, one thing they don't do is to actually look back at the impact that their leadership has had on the people they purport to lead. Often those people have different ways in which they assess what our policies do. And whenever and so how do we do this? And that is the role sometimes of a critical intellectual. A critical intellectual is not a person who is there to dress up the emperor. A critical intellectual is there to ask the hard questions and to want to talk truth to power. And that is more vital than ever. A lot of people in this context say, what is the future of humanities? But more than ever, humanities become important, because what is the essence of humanities? The essence of humanities is the study and anticipation of social relations. And COVID has shown us that our social relations are going to be fundamentally changed by the present conjuncture. Secondly, what does a humanity show us? That how do we think about data? How do we collect knowledge? How do we think about knowledge production has become a huge thing. The go-to way of doing research for the humanities, especially in sociology and anthropology, is fieldwork. But now we are dealing with secondhand information. We are dealing with big data. We are dealing with knowledge that comes through many processes that can be ideological tainted and siphoned in particular ways. And so in our classrooms, in our debates, in our academic conferences, how are we able to produce a critical imagination that can use big data and existing data in ways that see through the ideological constraints of that? How do we think about knowledge production, not just about decolonizing the curriculum, but how do we show leadership in our research by doing primary research to produce new knowledge for new archives? And for me especially, that kind of leadership becomes important, that in this great quest in which we have the call to decolonize the curriculum, it seems the other part of the pedestal is left untouched. And that is to produce new knowledge, new ways of seeing things, and trying to understand new ways in which we can socially relate. And this stretches from the individual, from the everyday, right into the usual ways in which we think about macroeconomic policy. Already we see that many of the African National Congress leaders who post-1994 heaped abuse on something called the basic income grant, saying it will create a handout mentality, are now starting to consider it. So right before our eyes, the policies that were propagated are starting to come into the public domain in new ways. What kind of leadership do we put into place? What kind of leadership can we display that can take advantage of this moment? And so how do we also think about professions? How do we think about the world? What COVID has taught me, that who were the frontline workers during COVID? The professor of sociology like myself, the vice chancellor, the dean? No, the frontline workers were everyday workers, the health workers. Those are the people, the frontline workers. And frontline workers means that those were the most important people in the world at that particular moment. And it's a sobering moment in how we think about hierarchy, how we think about the importance of occupation, and how we think finally about the commodification of everyday life. We have embarked since 1994 on the commodification of every aspect of our life as a solving of the financial purse of the state. We have, now if somebody was telling me that, like they say in the Bible, when the Good Samaritan saw the injured Jew, he just helped him. He didn't ask whether he had medical aid or not. But nowadays, the doctors don't even ask if you have medical aid. They ask if you have gap cover. We have turned water into money. We have changed apartheid's roadblocks, and the long road to freedom has toll roads everywhere. We have to roll back on this idea that we can commodify every part of our life. And lastly, does not this also signify a great moment for universities. My own university is shaped in a lager, that you enter the lager and there you shall be educated. But what COVID has taught us with online education is that if you're 50 years old, the last time you were in the classroom was 25 years ago. Really, you're off the pace. The skills you have are redundant. The certificate you have on your wall is almost doesn't mean anything in terms of knowledge. But what COVID has done with online education, it allows us to do these short courses. It allows us to reskill people. It allows us to take people in the field to bring their knowledge back into the lager and then leave again for bigger fields. And so COVID as opportunity, COVID as imagination, COVID as leadership that is able to change course and not just think they've been captain of the Titanic and they can just change around the chairs and all will be okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Desai, for those very critical questions and thought-provoking points. I'd like to open up for questions. I see there are some questions on the chat, but please send your questions through. And I think the two people that we'd like to address these questions, I think one speaker is gone, would be Prof. Rensburg and Prof. Desai. So whatever questions you have for them or comments, please share them on the chat. So I think the one question that I think would be really good to start with, given that there's been important points made about disruptions from Prof. Rensburg, and there's a lot of questions that came through Professor Desai on divisions and inequities. The one question that has come through is, what kind of leadership works best during a crisis? Are we talking in terms of a different type of leadership? And then what type of leadership does one want to build in thinking about a post-crisis type of environment? So is there anything more we'd like to expand on in terms of crisis and beyond crisis type of leadership that we need to think about? And once again, there's some appreciations for thinking in terms of our responses to disruptions. Another point that somebody raises here on the chat is that the pandemic came with good and bad things, but I really appreciate the good, because some of us will learn from it and become better leaders because of the challenges that came with COVID. So these questions are really asking for some additional thoughts about positioning oneself as a leader in different environments in this very turbulent type of context. Could there be a response from either Prof. Desai or Prof. Rensburg?
Thanks, Camilla. Maybe I could just kick off with a couple of those. So I guess the point about disruptions is that they've been with us, for millennia. And therefore, I think that the role of universities through teaching and learning, through public scholarship, through research, I believe would be to bring these to the fore, and to do so in a critical, self-reflective manner. I mean, the facts are that there is no magic wand, that there is no silver bullet, that change and transformation is excruciatingly slow, painfully slow. It's hard work. Building a radical democracy as opposed to a parliamentary democracy. It's hard work. It requires presence of mind. It requires activism. I guess my key point about disruptions is, number one, we are part of the long march of history. and we must extract lessons from that so that we don't make promises and claims that we are unable to fulfill, so to speak. And so when we speak COVID-19, fourth industrial revolution, and so on, it's important for us to weigh up the accomplishments, the prospects or prognosis, and the results of previous disruptions. And that requires hard, critical, intellectual work. And as I've sought to demonstrate in the instance of COVID-19, that at the same time as work can be excruciatingly slow, you can have a catalytic moment such as COVID-19, which simply opens up the possibility and the space for us to think fundamentally differently about who we are, about our societies, about our organizations and institutions, and about the world. And it provides the possibility for us to press forward towards a radical conception of democracy and freedom, rather than it being pigeonholed into a 1994 constitution only, by way of example. On types of leadership in crisis, of course, much conversation there. It seems to me that leadership in crisis is required in the first instance to be engaged, to be seen to be engaged, to be visible, to communicate, to be honest in that engagement. I think that's probably the sine qua non of leadership in crisis: visibility, honesty, integrity, communicating, engaged. A second criteria that I think is absolutely critical is that leaders have to, what I speak of, exit the role as administrative leader to the leadership on the ground, from the leader in the office to the leader on the ground, amongst the people, in conversation, in dialogue, hearing, listening, recalibrating. So those are just two things that come to mind. Obviously, a leader in a crisis needs to have a plan. In order to have a plan, a leader in crisis needs the other strong leaders in the room with that leader. So it's not a one-person leadership setting, in my view. It is about having that that group of strong and specialist leaders who are required for that particular role or moment to be in the room, to hear them, to listen to them, and to recalibrate all the time. Obviously not at the drop of a hat, but there must be good reasons why we recalibrate our plan or our tactic or our strategy at a particular moment in time. So those are just some of the things that immediately come to mind: engaged, visible, honest, communicative, on the ground, out of the office, working with the team of key leaders, ability to listen and hear, and ability to calibrate the plan, always looking for results as that plan unfolds. Just some thoughts from my side. A final observation on teaching and learning, and what does COVID-19 catalyze us to rethink about it? I think, again, nothing new. We've been reflecting as academics for some time now about the inexorable pull of the market on curriculum design and on program and on qualification design. And we've seen in the last 3 decades, in our experience here in South Africa, how the curriculum has moved, the undergrad curriculum in particular, has moved from a broad experience a broad general education, to almost commencement of the vocational or profession-based education in the first year of studies. It's clear that has really pushed out the possibilities of us being able to offer undergrad students a combination of the humanities and social sciences on the one hand, and the natural sciences and engineering offerings on the other. And of course, the benefit of being able to offer both of these at the same time. I believe if we were able to rethink and reinvent the curriculum, and of course, I know that the pull of the market, as Ashwin was speaking of, the commodification of qualifications, I hesitate, I struggle to see us making moves here. But there is absolutely nothing wrong for us able, for example, to say, why isn't it possible for 25% of our undergrad enrollment to be pulled into a college program of this kind, in particular where the professional qualification or vocational qualification can benefit from such a general education, such as law, by way of example. That's just one of many examples that immediately come to mind. Obviously, the idea of project-based learning, problem-based learning, interdisciplinary learning in undergrad studies, and I focus in particular on undergrad studies. These are all possibilities and opportunities that can avail themselves and can enable us to activate a different kind of undergraduate student and graduate student for that matter as well. So those are just some initial thoughts. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. I think your comments cover a number of the questions. Perhaps another question related to what you've just said, Prof. Rensburg. There's a question here about for you on the role that my comment to a question to Prof. Rensburg is, what role does education have to play in creating a caliber of learning mechanisms? But I think that one of the questions we also had was, do universities have a responsibility to nurture a new emerging leadership? And if so, what are the kinds of things that universities should be doing? Because there is a sense that our leadership is close to retirement, of getting older, and it's a particular kind of leadership, a particular voice that is articulated. Is there something more that we need to do to nurture an emerging leadership within our institutions? And then there's a completely different question here about what is our response to being forced to take vaccines? What do universities do? Because we've been talking recently about the need for everyone to be vaccinated so that we get back to campus. So what is your view about vaccinations? Vaccinations are saving lives, but is making them, with the request to make them compulsory, be seen as fascist? So maybe I could ask you just for those two responses, and if Prof. Desai, you want to come in, I'd be also interested in your view. Does a government have a right to force citizens under conditions of democracy?
I think Ashwin should take that one.
Okay, Ashwin, would you like to come in?
Well, let me say that, I would want everybody to take advantage of the vaccine, and that unless you have arguments that are really to the contrary, because if you're just putting your own body at risk, that's fine. But you are putting everybody else in an environment at risk. And therefore, an institution, if you want to come to my house and I say to a party and I say, are you vaccinated or not? I don't think that's fascism. Just like when I tell people, if you don't bring a bottle of single malt whiskey, you can't come to my party. We all lay down some rules about social relations. And I don't think that's an act of fascism for a university to say that we really encourage you to get vaccinated. So that for me, would be my response, and I'm happy to debate it. And I can see why there's some sense that nothing should be forced down our throat. But the very people who I debate with about vaccines, they're busy taking Panados and cough syrup and so on. And then suddenly, and they're going to hospitals, but suddenly they want to isolate vaccines as outside that acceptance of certain kinds of medicine. But if you don't mind, Camilla, what I wanted to discuss is that one of the questions was about, can't we move fully to an online university? I just want to say two things to this. Firstly, we need to discuss and debate this idea that we're all going online, because one of the things that could happen is, why shouldn't students then register at Harvard University? The biggest number of students at Harvard University, over 500,000, I think, is online. And then what happens to our universities is that you get trained in a particular way with particular examples for particular societies. Yet what COVID has taught us is that you need to have local ideas. You need to understand local dynamics. You need to understand local food supply systems. You need to understand local racial dynamics in order to be effective as a person in society. So that's one day. Secondly, I wouldn't rule out what maybe myself and Prof. Naidu and Prof. Rensburg and Prof. Marwala come from another generation, surely. But our greatest education was the networks we had with other students in the classroom and outside the classroom. To get rid of that as part of education, those kinds of social solidarities that emerge at universities, I think would change the nature of how we define education and what is education. So maybe I'm old school there and wanting to hesitate that we move fully to an online university.
Prof. Desai, I'll ask you this question to follow on from what you've suggested. There's a question here. Is it valid, in your view, to suggest that this pandemic is a global unifier? Can it be seen as a unifier? In other words, despite diversity in wealth, opportunity, access, support across the world, all people have lost loved ones, friends, colleagues to this virus. And this means we are aware of a global shared experience. Can we make a difference in how we move forward as the human race? Are there opportunities to see some global connections through recognition of this pandemic and how it has affected all of us?
Well, and of course, it creates a lot of those kinds of social solidarities. But we also have to see how COVID indicates that when we watch a game in England this weekend on Saturday afternoon, there are 50,000 people in the stadium because they took vaccines that, if they had 50 million people in England, they had 200 million vaccines. They were hoarding vaccines. That the North took a particular attitude towards vaccines, that we have to rely on the patents of pharmaceutical firms in the North. That doesn't, so we have to have a critical approach that certain basic medicines should not have patents. Certain basic medicines should be available to society for free. This is not an outlandish demand. This is it. Then we can start talking, even if we don't achieve it, if governments and leaders in the North start talking this language, then we can start talking about that, yes, we're all in this together. But right now, I think it's just not happening. Secondly, somebody said, go beyond anecdotals, but the people who are taking vaccines are getting COVID in high rates. Well, Prof. Rensburg, is a pharmacist by trade and, broke many barriers as a pharmacist in terms of medicine. I don't want to answer that. But I can tell you now, that is rubbish in the sense that those who are getting COVID are not dying. Those who are getting COVID after having the vaccine are not entering hospitals in those numbers. So yes, at one level, nobody said you still can't get COVID, but it does give you a much less dramatic kind of COVID that can kill you. And that, then you must present then, if you say that there's other data, then present that data that says that even after the double shot, the death rates of those with the double shot are still dying in those numbers. And then we must take cognizance of that.
Just
Thank you
a
very
footnote
much.
there, Kamala. So if I look at the COVID-19 statistics of Grooteskier as on the 6th of September, total number of COVID-19 patients on ventilators, 32. Number vaccinated, 0. Number unvaccinated, 32. If I look at the COVID-19 hospitalizations in high care or in the ICU, 66 in high care ICU, 0 vaccinated, 66 unvaccinated. If I look at the hospitalization, meaning in general wards now, 156 hospitalized, of whom 3 are vaccinated and 153 are unvaccinated. So what's my point? My point is simply on the specific issue here, is that the science is pretty straightforward. That yes, you can still get COVID-19, the virus, even after you are fully vaccinated. There's no question about that. It is like taking a flu vaccine and you're still getting flu later. There is nothing different there. There is no case to be made against not taking the virus. The case here simply is you going on a ventilator, invasive ventilator, that you going into high care or the ICU, or you going into a general ward. The evidence is clear. It is the unvaccinated amongst us who will find themselves on an invasive ventilator in high care and in a hospital. But I think that the bigger question here is about public science, about public information, about our scientists being out in the public space and communicating effectively the science of COVID-19 in this specific instance. And I do think that therefore our universities, ipso facto our scientists, have a significant role to play in terms of getting into the public space. Although, of course, we have seen how fascism in the US, by way of example, can throw every trick in the book at science as being anti-science. So I think we just need to be alert to the very fascist movement that challenges science itself. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. There's lots of questions coming in, and there's one question. Well, yeah, there's one question about what lessons, if any, can the COVID-19 pandemic offer when it comes to increasing the social impact of academic research? So is there something different that we need to think about in looking at our research, given the disruption and the challenge we've now faced with COVID-19? Do we need to do some rethinking about our research, its impact? Do we need to have more conversations about impact? Is it different? Do we see this as necessitating some disruption in terms of our own focus? So what has this pandemic and the crisis that we face, what has it done to research, social research, and our thinking about its impact? Any comments about that?
Yeah, I guess I can jump in on that one, the latter one. So I think that there are 2 dimensions here in my view. The first is the demystification of science. And I do think that during especially the COVID period, especially apologies, the first and second waves, we've seen an excellent example of this in Professor Slim Karim, who invested so much of his time being on virtually every radio and television station, seeking to communicate the science of the COVID-19 virus. And so I think that there is therefore that one dimension, which and that example that I think all of us as academics and as scientists need to reflect on, and therefore ask the question, to what extent are we playing the public scientist role that we can and should play, and what are the capabilities and skills required in order to play that public role comfortably, confidently, and in a manner that is informative, in a manner that is what is the word, easy to engage with from the point of view of the public. And so that's one dimension. The second dimension, of course, is precisely the manner in which you posed the question, Camilla. And that is asking questions about whether we have now reached, in respect of science, in respect of publications specifically, whether we have reached a point where we need to rethink how we incentivize research. As things stand at the moment, the state subsidizes quote unquote approved publications as per a publications list to the tune of about 100,000 rands per full publication. That initiative had been in place certainly since the advent of democracy, certainly from '96 onwards. Initially starting at a value of close to 180,000 rands and then dropping off because of the spike in research 6-7 years ago. The publication output has plateaued as we speak. It has plateaued very early, so much so that it had plateaued well behind that of developing nations, from South Korea across to Malaysia by way of example. And we expect that South Africa's publications output will too early. So there is a question mark, therefore, about publications output on the one hand, and perhaps more challengingly, should the research incentive not be redesigned, as we recommend in a committee report to the Minister of Higher Education, Science and Innovation, that we recommend that the research incentive should be revised in a manner that perhaps over the next decade sees us moving from funding 100%, funding any publication, to funding publications, yes, 50% of all funding going to any publication by 2030, and 50% going towards funding publications with social and economic impact, on the understanding that we had developed and socialized an understanding of what social and economic impact is across the humanities and social sciences, the natural sciences, and engineering and technology. So there is a big question to be asked and answered. That report is now out, and if it's not out in the broader public domain, it will be out shortly. But the idea is for us to rethink the incentivization, because the incentivization has worked extremely well to catalyze publications output, except it has plateaued very early on this journey. Just some thoughts.
No, thank you very much. Ashwin, I see you'd like to come in.
Just to say, that, firstly, now more than ever, knowledge is power, power is knowledge. It's knowledge, 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 because everything that we took as sacrosanct, everything that we learned in catechism school, everything that we learned in the Vedas and the Bible and Quran has been challenged in terms of what is knowledge? What is the future of cities? What is the future of universities? What is the future of sex? These all things are up for grabs, and we need to be we have to be head of the pack. We can't be just followers. These are not just religious institutions where things can be handed down and you swallow it. And it is young people that can be ahead of the pack. So the world that I grew up in, we were imitations. Prof. Rensburg will tell you, I met him in 1979. We were reading Trotsky and Lenin. We want to imitate the Bolshevik Revolution. Everything about us was imitation, even the way we dressed and cut our hair. But now it's the age of innovation. Now it's the age of imagination. All old shibboleths have been fallen. In this age of uncertainty, it's time to grab a moment. And that is why sometimes, I and I agree, we love the fact that the Springboks are winning, but we worried about the way they play because we want Cheslin Colby to hand off a big line. We want to run the ball. We want to move with speed. So this is where we are. It's out of all this mess, even race, we need to rethink how we're thinking about race and racism and anti-racism. So these old things come back in new forms. And our curriculum, you can't go back and just talk about the sociology of work. You have to talk about the sociology of new work, the sociology of no work. What is criminality in this day and age? How do you define criminality? What is the criminology? What is psychology in this time? So these things, all our disciplines, biology, science, the medical sciences are now need to start reorientating themselves. And so we can't, the new revolution will not be pronounced from above, but will be built through many aspects of our lives. And I'm really, heartened by the kind of way people are taking on people. What I find is that, we're challenging each other about how we think even about tourism. Just think something about tourism studies. Everything like Mauritius is built on 95% tourism. Everything they import, their meat, their chicken, everything. Their tourism industries collapsed. And now they're having to be humble and rethink the economy. Whether they'll get it right or not, I don't know. So everything, tourism boards, tourism education, biology, science, but still the fact, what Iron just put forward about numbers, facts are still sacrosanct. Research is still sacrosanct. Look at the figures he produced from Krutiski. These are things that are still at the center of our lives. But how we get there, what do we do with those statistics? How we reimagine the institutions that imprison us at the moment in particular ways of thinking, that's our challenge.
Thank you so much, Ashwin, for that. So there's one question here that maybe relates to and follows from what you're saying, since there is this sense that there's more that can be done. And what is our relationship to civil society and the building of an active citizenry? So there's a question here that says, I also believe that radical campaigns for active citizenry should be promoted. I believe this will facilitate shared ideologies without attaching class to it. Ordinary South Africans must be given value in their voices, maybe, or somehow it'll foster responsibility. We saw that play out during the recent looting activities in KZN and Gauteng, where the rest of the citizens decided they will not participate. So in thinking about leadership and about change generally, what is our feeling about our role in terms of working towards an active citizenry, and what does this mean? How can we think about it? Any thoughts on that? Prof. Rensburg.
Yeah, I guess that the two dimensions again of this. On the one hand, it is picking up on Ashwin's earlier conversation. It is about political activism in the context of our universities. It is about our political student organizations, by way of example, becoming far more focused on nurturing exemplary leadership along the lines that we are reflecting on today. It does mean read as well. I recall during my undergrad years, especially during holidays, short and long holidays, going through volume upon volume upon volume, so that 18, 19, 20-year-olds already steeped in the Bolshevik Revolution, in the Chinese Revolution, in the Cuban Revolution, in the revolutions in West Africa, and of course across our continent, steeped in the decolonization movement. And there is no replacement for that. You can't, learn that through reading a couple of pieces in Daily Maverick. That's not going to help you. It's going to catalyze you, but you're going to have to go deep to the original texts. And so I think that is critical. And the idea, of course, is for you to be able to reflect critically on these revolutions, on these movements and challenges, and of course to extract lessons from there. And ideally, in groups, in networks, in your fora, in your political student organizations or other organizations. And so I think that is a role that we as academics are probably loath to play. We'll probably play it in our individual capacities rather than in our institutional capacity. So there is an interesting question. So we probably would play it by setting up our own networks of young students, of students who we may wish to guide, to direct, if you like, to point to material, and then to have reflections with them. The question is, can that be institutionalized? Big and interesting question there. It seems to me that should be institutionalized in our political organizations and movements and community-based organizations. I just don't think that the time is set aside either by our young leaders at a systemic level or our organizations themselves. So we have a number of schools with our political organizations. The question is, what's the traction? What's the participation? What's the results of those engagements? And so there is work to be done there. And maybe Ashen should ask the question, do we do our work simply through the publications that we put together? So in sport, for example, Ashwin and colleagues do a number of historical reflections and provide accounts of the history of sport and why history matters. Is that the way we play our role? And in other social domains, is our role, in addition to our publications, also to put out these kinds of works that enable our leaders, young future leaders, to have access to this kind of historicity and science. So those are the kind of thoughts and observations on my side. On active citizenry, I guess I just again need to take us back to my earlier reflection, in which I guess drawing on people like Chantal Mouffe and Ernesto Leclos, who explore the ideas of nurturing radical democracies, building from that, and using the example of inclusion, exclusion. Yesterday, you were excluded because you were Jewish, shortly, and at the same time because you were Black, and at the same time because you were woman, and because at the same time you were rural, and because at the same time you might have been disabled, and at the same time because you were gay or queer, or lesbian or intersex, and so on. That has changed fundamentally, as I've sought to demonstrate in my conversation. And these have not just happened autonomously. They are the result of struggles. They are the results of painful and hard work, painfully slow outcomes. But they are the result of those efforts over the decades and centuries, so to speak. And so when I speak, therefore, of an active citizenry, it is about an active citizenry pressing forward towards opening spaces in our in our body politic, in our economy, in our communities, so that inclusivity, inclusion is seen rather than spoken about. I mean, our Constitution, Bill of Rights speaks of 16 conditions of discrimination that we fight against. And that's not an inclusive list at all. We probably should be talking of 100, 200 instances of inclusion and unfinished business for this active citizenry as we press forward to a more radical democracy. Just some thoughts?
Thank you so much. So I think I'm going to just ask you, just going to refer to 3 questions. And if I would be very happy if you could both maybe just make some comments about these 3 questions, and then we'll have like final comments and we move towards closure. The first is a question about climate change. You know, we were talking a lot about climate change prior to the pandemic, and how does leadership for the future also deal with the challenge of climate change more seriously? And there's some points about COVID-19 and what it has raised. So any thoughts about that? And the second one, there's a number of questions about violence against women in this period. So building women leadership in a time when women appear to be considerably under challenge, given lockdowns, etc. So I can just try and take one of them that says, on the one hand, 4IR and its related technologies has the potential for equalizing access to education, but also wonder what you make of the ways in which the acceleration of learning and working via various tech platforms from home has exacerbated some issues of gender inequity, as well as an uptake in gender-based violence. And then there are some questions on a good leader. What is a good leader? A person with integrity? What are the values of the good leader? And I think to some extent, these have been touched on already, but perhaps in just making final comments, you could just give us some of your thoughts, you know, to conclude today's session. So maybe Professor Rensburg, we start with you again, or whoever wants to come in.
I think Ashwin can go.
Ashwin looks like he's ready.
Thanks, Ira. So you know, firstly, just to go back, you know, if I was just young enough to still be a revolutionary, this idea of activism and active citizenry, I just realized now, and I'm just going to have to do that again. What power, I didn't realize this, what power this technology has, because it's asking me that, can I admit people? You know, so can you imagine that power? If I don't want you to come to the mass meeting and vote against me, I just don't admit you. And then it allows me to mute my dean for once if I want to. That's the power. That this, you know, you know, active citizenry also to think about, you know, yes, the old ways, the toy, the mass gatherings and so on. But it appears to me there's a whole other world. And we saw that in the recent uprising of Twitter, of social media, the role they play. But it also allows the ruling class a lot of power, because if we're all marching and suddenly we had a water cannon and we dispersed and the ruling class cut off our WhatsApp, then we won't know where to meet again. So you know, what kind of activism can be released by these new forms of social media, but how can they rebound upon you? Because these can often become individual forms of social media, individual forms of building a following, individual forms of putting one's forwards one's theories in the absence of a mass around that. So there's a whole world there, and I don't know enough about it. But let me just admit somebody now, or should I remove them? I don't know. Let's see. Who are they voting for? So that's the one thing. The second thing is, you know, on the climate change, I think, you know, and Dr. Davis Masonda will know better about this than me, is that politicians think, you know, can I make a statement about climate change, or should I build a house? If I build a house, I'll get one more vote. If I say something about climate change, I won't get a vote. So how do we impose this thing, this issue of climate change, show the interlinkages between COVID and climate change, this ecological disaster that confronts us? How do we interlink this? And I think, you know, Greta Thunberg has said some great things between COVID and climate change and global warming, and said, you know, that we all are in the nude now. You know, we all been exposed for not making those interlinkages. And In fact, Zizek has a great new book out on the pandemic that links these issues and asks us to think about these issues in interrelated ways. So, and that's once again the imagination, once again out of the crisis an opportunity. And that is why also the way we think about the humanities, biology, environmental sciences, all these historic disciplinary divisions, how do we able, even in people doing thesis, how do we able to break out of our own higher degrees committee and be able to say to students, you can do an incredible thesis that cuts across disciplines, that interlinks these issues, rather than we being ghetto highs into our holes. So that for me, you know, we fight where we are. We make differences where we are. Yes, we can worry about the whole world, but you know, whether we're going to get on Elon Musk's spacecraft and go to another planet and live there. But we fight where we are. And many of us have some kind of say and power where we are. Are we using this moment to change things, to not change things for the sake of them, but to reassess the way we're doing things and do things anew? That for me is what leadership is. Leadership is also not just about integrity. Leadership is not just about, the Pope can be, have a lot of integrity, or the head of the mosque in Kabul. But it's also about taking hard decisions. It's also about saying this is a direction in which we want to go, and that there are costs to this direction. Like leadership is about saying that we'd expect you to be vaccinated to come onto the campus because you're going to hurt other people. And lastly, to say, yes, I see Owen makes a point. He said, yes, he said only the word of God can heal COVID. And only God can't fail. Yes, only God can't fail. Yes, but my mother put Lourdes holy water on my head when I went to write matric. But so it helped me. But I had to pass. Not God was writing the exam. And that's what we face now. God helps those who are able to imagine themselves in new ways, in new times. And that's what leadership is.
Thank you, Professor Desai. Prof. Rensburg, over to you.
Thanks very much. I'll also offer some remarks on leadership, but first on the scourge of GBV and femicide and the silences in our societies. I think this is absolutely devastating and disgraceful that we don't have conversations about these. So yes, we have Slim Karim being a public speaker and a person who can speak comfortably about this in the media to us, and we welcome that. So who is speaking to us on GBV and on femicide? And so I do think that, again, our scholars, our academics do need to enter the public scholarship space to have debate and dialogue on these very same channels where we talk about COVID-19 and related issues. So I agree entirely with the exasperation and concern expressed. It is time for us to, catalyzed by the possibilities shown with COVID-19, to rise up to this scourge on our society and our community. And again, it takes me back to the earlier observation that it's going to be painfully and excruciatingly slow, but we have to press forward to nurture a radical democracy in this space. Ditto for climate change. It's not off the agenda. It is on the agenda. COP26 is only days away now, and we're all interested in the outcomes or the next level of commitments that come out of that conversation. On climate change, I've, for example, not seen a range of experts speak to us about transitional justice for countries in the South who sit like us with probably 250 years worth of coal What do we do with that coal? Do we walk away from that coal? I saw a note earlier this morning from a colleague showing that the UK is experiencing massive power crises and have just begun to restoke their old power plants. So what does this all mean? Again, the answers are not simple in the climate mitigation project, as important and critical as that project is. The answers are not straightforward. Again, advancing a radical democracy in that space, excruciatingly, painfully slow, the process, but we have to press on with that work. On the 4IR, it can throw up, as it has until now, again, a divide in our nation and across our nations, in the South and across the North and the South. Again, we need to draw courage from the intellectual space, the energy, and the drive that's been opened by COVID-19, the new surges of energy that have been opened up by that, to push open, maybe prize open initially, but push open the space so that we can democratize digitalization. And so finally, on a good leader, I just want to read one or two observations from my book published at the end of last year, pages 297, Some Leadership Lessons. And I'll just refer to a couple of these. I say here that first, leaders should accelerate their learning and continuously be open to learning themselves. I'd come to know that it would be fatal to believe that a leader, by being appointed a leader, has absolutely nothing to learn. The high and often unhealthy levels of competition amongst leaders, who are far more adept at showing off than hearing, than acknowledging and celebrating a peer and a colleague's accomplishments, does result in leaders failing to learn from their peers. The consequence is that entire sectors, universities, state organs, commerce, and industry fail to benefit and are far too often comfortable with repeating costly mistakes. And so leaders should search for and find life mentors and coaches. I say next that leaders must, as they promote their leadership philosophies, visions, and ambitions, and as they build organizational momentum, continuously assess their vulnerabilities, watch out for their strengths, relearn how to learn, and reconnect with and put to use their networks. There is absolutely no point served by becoming an office-bound, flat-footed, and isolated leader. The organization will quickly default to a rudderless and adrift ship. After all, this is not why leaders were called upon and then took on these leadership roles. I also observe that as leaders rise in leadership, so they should diminish themselves to elevate others to prominence and to celebrate their accomplishments. Creating special moments to recognize colleagues' accomplishments take little effort, yet elevate their spirits and waters their desire to go even further. I also observe that leaders should take themselves or their persona less seriously than they should take their roles and responsibilities. By this I mean, let us leave our egos and super egos at the entrance gates, for we accomplish great things with and through our colleagues. Our mannerisms and how we relate to our peers and colleagues, the way we listen, speak, dialogue, sit, walk, dress, okay, that's a cis heterosexual perspective perhaps, all send signals of caring or egotism, empathy or indifference, humility or self-importance, kindness or disinterest, compassion or aloofness, altruism or selfishness, honor or duplicity, and grace or disrespect. I also say that we are constantly reminded that the status quo is not an option. Often we are caught out and caught up in crises, precipitated by colleagues and activists who had become fed up with our inability to consider their points of view. We need to be far more alert to the limits that the status quo imposes on opportunities for nurturing inclusive, diverse, and empowered communities and societies. This requires, with the right people and expertise in the room, ongoing, iterative, inclusive, and self-critical reflection, analysis, deconstruction, and the synthesis of groundbreaking interventions that trigger virtuous circles. And finally, for today, even after having built institutional and external social capital carefully, crises sourced from sectoral and national systemic troubles can quickly dissolve leaders' hard-earned equity and overwhelm them and their institution. I observe, do not give up and do not give in. Leaders may have to default to the activist on-the-ground leader to rally their colleagues and staff and to press home their compelling vision, mission, and higher purposes. Remind themselves that here lies another possibility to turn crisis into opportunity. And they do, as they do so, they should maintain their composure and calm, and through their body language, selection of words and phrases, tone, and so on, send the right messages. Okay, last one. As leaders nurture and build their teams and their institutions, they must remember that they exist within an ecosystem. They must temper their inward focus, set aside time to deliberate and collaborate with peers, always seeking win-win, virtuous upward circle-headed solutions than zero-sum, downward spiraling ones. So those are just some thoughts on leading in crisis, and perhaps some thoughts on what it is to be a quote-unquote good leader.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Prof. Rensburg. I think that was truly outstanding. So I think we've come to the end of the webinar. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you to Prof. Rensburg, Prof. Marwala, Dr. Mlambo Ngcuka, and Professor Desai, and to all the organizers of today's events, and to our audience. I think this has been a most thought-provoking and certainly an inspiring discussion on, broadly speaking, the topic of leadership. We are certainly in a critical moment of our history, overwhelmed by the insecurities generated by an unprecedented pandemic, and with multiple challenges, unemployment, rising death rates, politics at the crossroads, threats of further social unrest, and gender-based violence that we talked about today. We certainly need a deep reflection and critical discussion on questions of leadership. And since this is a collaboration with the O.R. Tambo School, what can we learn from the generation of O.R. Tambo, and how do we rethink leadership in the present? How can we reimagine and rebuild leadership to augment those qualities that we hold dear, such as courage and vision? So perhaps through UJ's collaboration with the O.R. Tambo School of Leadership, we can in the future take some of these points that came through to today's webinar, take it forward in future discussions. So on a final note, thank you once again, and thanks for joining us, and have a great evening. All the best. Thank you.